Welcome, everyone. My name is Amy Shimshan Santo, and I'm really happy to welcome you here to Claremont Graduate University. The mission of our university is to create knowledge and prepare leaders to enter the world with a purpose and skills to make it a better place. So today is absolutely an honor to welcome our guest speakers, Heather Infantry and Katrina DeBerry from Atlanta, who have taken very significant action to make the world a better place. And we're going to be able to hear a little bit about their journey. I would like to begin by just introducing you to my colleague, Robin Sukadia, who is a fantastic tabla player, an expert father, and an adjunct faculty here at CGU, and he teaches our fundraising courses. Robin.
Thank you, Amy. And thank you all for being here today for what's going to be a pretty incredible conversation, a vibrant conversation. We're going to be talking a lot about money and how it specifically relates to access and racial equity in the city of Atlanta, and by virtue, all of us and beyond in all the different metros across the country. Heather and Katrina, thank you for making the time to be here and sharing your perspectives, your insights, and giving us some guidance, really, because we're looking to you and to Atlanta as really a model, and in terms of this dialogue. So I just wanted to let everyone know the bios for all the panelists are in the chat, and you can find that in the Google Doc there. And just, what to expect here today. We're going to be covering a number of topics over the course of the next 60 minutes. And each topic will be introduced by Amy or myself, and we're going to direct the conversation towards Katrina and Heather. And we'll kind of alternate questions between Amy and myself as we go through the hour here. And the idea here is to have these conversations in real time with two very, very vibrant leaders of Atlanta, who I think represent two sides of a coin, which is the funder and the grantee, or in a lot of ways the receiver and the recipient and the giver. So really excited about that. We're going to have a Q&A toward the end, so feel free to share questions in the chat. We will aggregate those and try to hold most of them towards the end of the panel today. About 45 minutes in, we'll try to focus in on a Q&A, but time permitting, we may have a smaller Q&A midway through. So we look forward to hearing from you. Feel free to engage with us through the chat, and we're gonna take it away from there. So I'll hand it back over to Amy. She's going to take us through the first topic.
So being here today, we thought since many of the people listening are from Los Angeles, we should do a very quick framing for why Los Angeles and Atlanta. First of all, I will say I heard about these amazing women's efforts through a friend who is also an artist named Ife Williams, who's an Atlanta-based artist. And Heather very kindly opened her, time to us to tell us a little bit more about her story. And then there's lots of wonderful materials available online now about what they've achieved. But why should these two cities be in conversation? Lots of times in Los Angeles, we talk about Los Angeles as the cultural hub of the United States, when today we're humbling ourselves and saying, no, actually, what can a place like LA that's 10 million people learn from a really vibrant cultural hub, another vibrant cultural hub like Atlanta? And both cities are very important cities and regions with cultural influence in the arts and culture and in social movements. But obviously in terms of population size, LA is 4 million in the city, 10 million in the county, whereas Atlanta is 523,000 in the city, and we've heard about 5.5 million in the region. In terms of our demographics, we're also not really the same. LA is really there's more ethnic mixture, for example, in LA. We have a Latinx majority population with about 9% African American and 29% Anglo, et cetera. Whereas in Atlanta, it's 52% Black and very small populations, 4% Latino or 4% API. Obviously, in terms of the racial and financial inequalities that have been invented and reproduced through white domination and cultural hegemony, we still seeing in both spaces majority white boardrooms, majority white executive leaderships, majority white funding trends. And so demographic change in both of our cities hasn't really translated into representative decision-making and power with financial opportunity. And these two women put pressure on it together using solid, very interesting strategies to be able to liberate over $1 million this year for Black arts organizations in the region. And so without any further ado, I would like to, I'm going to toss it back to, are we going to Heather now?
Yeah.
All right.
Thank you. Thank you.
Tell us a little bit more about Atlanta.
Hi, everyone. So good to be here. And I'm so grateful for this opportunity. I was sharing with Amy and Robin that over the weekend I was preparing my slides, and it was almost sort of this like falling back in love with this city that I, like so many other people, had. I'm a transplant from Toronto, and I came here in '95, and this city just enveloped me. They just embraced me. And it was really the cultural community that helped me to find my voice and to help me to determine like who I wanted to be and how I wanted to show up in the world. And so it's such a great full circle moment to come back and to reflect on that time, both my own experiences, but also just the very complicated, layered, but so rich landscape that is Atlanta. And so I'm like grateful for this opportunity to share it from my perspective. So here's that article from 1971 that Ebony Magazine put on. This is actually a screenshot from that article back in the 70s, asking the question and also sort of making the claim that Atlanta is this Black Mecca. It is this populous Black city that has had an interesting racial history and has given way to some Black wealth and prosperity, and was becoming this hub of folks that are returning to the South. As we know, Atlanta is also the birthplace of Dr. Martin Luther King, and was the backdrop for all of the work that he did to create incredible gains within the civil rights movement. We've also been known around the country for the Atlanta child murders. We're known for the hub of historically Black colleges and universities, more notably Morehouse College, Spelman, which have produced some of the most elite Black academics and business people and politicians. We were home to the 1996 Olympics, and we are often noted as the city too busy to hate, the city that has figured out some sort of racial solidarity and harmony, which is a great facade, but you know, those of us who've been here long enough know that there's much work to be done with regards to that. Atlanta is also the home of the busiest airport in the world. We serve on average 55+ million passengers a year. And most recently, we have become known as the Hollywood of the South. There hasn't been a Marvel movie, including Black Panther, that hasn't been made here. And not only has Atlanta shown up just in terms of its geography in film, it's now become central characters in movies that we're seeing. Most notably, Atlanta, the television show that Donald Glover put together that we're all awaiting, third season. Atlanta, as I was beginning to say before, has also enjoyed nearly 50 years of Black political leadership. Maynard Jackson, who's pictured on the right here, was the first Black mayor appointed in 1974, who would go on to serve 2 terms. During his tenure, during his first administration, he opened the Office of Cultural Affairs, which was specifically created to support and celebrate art. And it also became sort of a portal for really uplifting art and artists of African descent. And so things like the National Black Arts Festival and Hammond's House and all of these other great entities have resulted in and continue to exist. And that Office of Cultural Affairs is still around to this day. In 2017, on the left, we appointed Keisha Lance Bottoms as mayor. She was part of a slate of about 13 candidates. And literally this woman came out of nowhere. She had a seat on city council, didn't know a lot about her, but she very narrowly won a runoff election against another white woman named Mary Norwood, who would have disrupted this legacy of Black leadership had she won. And in her acceptance speech, Keisha told the crowd, never underestimate the power of Black girl magic. And those of us for whom a notion like that really resonates with us you know, it was such a moment of like great pride, and it spawned this whole hashtag. My mayor's name is Keisha. She's also a FAMU grad. So in her being appointed as mayor, it also gave, you know, rise to just the HBCU experience. This year, she was named Glamour Woman of the Year. She's really been catapulted into the national spotlight, one for being on the short list for VP for the President of the United States, and also for the very strong stance that she took against our Republican Governor Kemp, in response to his protocols or lack of protocols in dealing with the pandemic. She's pictured here in front of a mural by a local artist named Shaniqua Gay. And these women that she is pictured in front of are iconic African-American women in history. So in '95, when I came to Atlanta, Southern hip hop was sort of a new emerging thing. And at that time, Outkast, which was a new hip hop group coming out, won at the Hip Hop Source Awards Rap Duo of the Year. And in receiving that award, they were booed. They were booed by that entire crowd. And in frustration and angst, Andre 3000 told that crowd, the South has got something to say. And it was almost prophetic in a way, because 20 years later, there isn't a sound, there isn't a dance move, there isn't any sort of like cultural anything that doesn't have an Atlanta slant on it. To the right is a picture from the Trap Music Museum that T.I. created a couple of years ago, paying homage to trap music, life, music, and lifestyle. And anywhere you are in the globe, regardless of what genre of music that you're in, if it doesn't have like a trap beat underneath it somewhere, then you're not capturing the moment. And so Atlanta as a sort of iconic cultural force, 20 years after being booed mercilessly at the Hip Hop Awards, is really sort of a wonderful moment for those of us that claim Atlanta as our home. I love this meme of "Stop moving to Atlanta, we full." If you look up "we full," it's a whole apparel, like you can get t-shirts and other kind of paraphernalia. But the meme is funny, but it's also very serious, because it's a great example of how our city has been designed to support cars and not people. You know, if you're a planning student or an architectural student, Atlanta oftentimes was held up as the poster child for not what to do in terms of city design. And that as a city, we've been really, despite being the city too busy to hate, we've been plagued by racist policies and laws that have undermined the quality of life for everybody. You know, the reason why we sort of swap places in the top 5 for worst traffic congestion is because we have an inadequate public transit system that wasn't supported in the early days of its creation. There were parts of our metro region that refused to allow for it to come to their communities under the notion that they didn't want certain kinds of people coming in because they were going to steal their televisions. And so we sit in traffic, really terrible traffic, because of racism. But at the same time, we're growing exponentially. We're one of the fastest growing metropolitan areas in the country. We are expected to triple our population in the next 20 to 30 years. We're home to some of the most notable brands: Delta, Coca-Cola, UPS, Home Depot, Georgia Pacific, you name them, and they have their headquarters here. And we also have this very prominent, visible Black middle and upper middle class. Tyler Perry, who put Tyler Perry Studios here and really came to fame while doing his work in Atlanta, has just now been added to the Forbes list of the wealthiest people in the world. He's now officially a billionaire. And below him is the Russell family pictured. Herman Russell, no longer living, but in the center there, started a construction and real estate business right around the time that Maynard Jackson had become mayor, and benefited from some of the programs around minority contracts that Jackson had put into place. So he was very instrumental in the expansion of the airport, and like so many other folks have enjoyed great wealth and influence. He served as one of the first Black members of the Atlanta Chamber of Commerce. So Atlanta is rich in all of these incredible ways, but we still are plagued by income disparity that Amy sort of alluded to, despite the very visible middle class in our Black community. Depending on where you are born, there are zip codes where you won't mitigate poverty, regardless of what interventions are made, that you have a 4% chance if you are born in certain zip codes to get out of that. And so these are the things that we contend with, and we are not at all exempt from everything that's been happening with the pandemic and with the crisis of police brutality. Here we have pictured on the left is a piece that was commissioned by Time magazine by Charlie Palmer, an Atlanta-based fine artist. This piece is called In Her Eyes, and he says, quote, "A girl is faced with both the injustice of today and America's historical role in it." And on the right is a photograph by Sheila Prebright, who's also an Atlanta-based photographer who characterizes herself as a cultural anthropologist. She went down to Rashad Brooks's funeral. That's Rashad Brooks pictured on that tapestry. If you recall, he is the young man whose life was taken from him, murdered by police officer Garrett Rolfe on June 12th. And his funeral was held, paid for by Tyler Perry, and was held at Ebenezer Baptist Church, the historic church home of Dr. King and Daddy King, is now presided over by Raphael Warnock, who is running for a Georgia Senate seat. And so Sheila Prebright went down there to document the occasion. And this picture is so moving and touching to me, because I think a lot about what an image like this will mean 20 years from now for folks looking back, in the same way that we look at an image of John Lewis on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in his trench coat with his backpack. How we will look at this picture while we look at these folks holding up this tapestry of this man while wearing masks, what it will do to support and inspire future movements to come. So Atlanta is rich, and this is where we find ourselves in the context of this conversation that we are about to have right now.
Katrina, you've said that Atlanta is a small town with big pants, and I know that we just heard a bunch of information from Heather. Is there any little nuance that you'd like to include into that with your work on, I know that, you know, part of your responsibility is amplifying resident voice and decision-making to advance social and economic mobility in communities. Are there any other details that you'd like to add on to what Ms. Infantry just shared with us?
So other than to also acknowledge that I am an Atlanta transplant as well, Atlanta welcomes so many different people from different parts of the country and the world that I would be remiss to not acknowledge that. And I came in 1993, and my HBCU, which was Clark Atlanta University. Please don't count on your fingers how many years ago that is, but this place of opportunity for Black people that was the draw for me. It took me a little longer. I'm originally from New York. It took me a little longer to get acclimated into the culture of Atlanta. But once I did, I realized that this was where I was going to make my home and where I was going to be for the long term. So, and I can also say the foundation, my favorite part of being there was a conversation that I had or a meeting that I attended where I got to quote Outkast as a reason for why I wasn't going to consider a traditional form of funding for an organization that I had worked with. So Atlanta and the South in general has really not only touched my life, but it has touched the lives of so many of us within the country and community in ways that we're just now talking about in a really thoughtful way. One of the things that I just wanted to make clear, because I am here representing the Community Foundation, is to, before we dive into and I got to work together more specifically, is what the role of a community foundation is and how that definition really was a struggle for me in this arts work in the beginning. And so because we are in the age of modern technology, I Googled it. So just a really clear definition of a community foundation. And Candid defined as a tax exempt shared organization that provides support for the needs of the geographic community or region where it is based, from funds that it maintains and administers on behalf of multiple donors. And so what the struggle is in that definition is, how do you and the community in a thoughtful way, right? And so some of the things that we contend with in a foundation, in a community foundation specifically, is, our mission is to connect our donors, philanthropic, what does that mean, and how do you find a balance in that? And I think it was made very clear in this call out, in our lack of equitable arts funding, that we struggle with it over time. I also have to admit, a program officer solely focused on the arts. And that also speaks to how decisions are made for a very specific piece of a body of work when placed in a broader spectrum of a community in totality. So those are some of the things that I just need to uplift as the students are thinking about what it means to be, fundraisers, what it means to work in this philanthropic space, how do you prioritize community in a system that benefits donors first.
Thank you so much, both of you. And for everyone who's listening, you'll see we have two women who work together from very different spaces. Ms. Berry being a part of the quote unquote structure, which we'll talk about a little bit later. She said that I'm a part of the structure because she's actually a philanthropist. She's, working somewhat like Inez Familiar Miller, who's also on this call. Hello, Inez, alumni of the program, who's with the Kresge Foundation, if I'm not mistaken. And then Heather as actually an agitator and community organizer among 23 different Black arts organizations, not just representing one space, but a coalition of affinity groups to put this work forward. So now we're going to transition to something we're probably all familiar with in our own way, but we like to see a little bit about, we're going to talk for just a moment about the call out. The call out that happened, I'm assuming, when COVID hit, when George Floyd was killed. This happened all over the world, but in a way, a call out could be a form of protest, but it can also be a form of structural change. And it seems like you two figured out how you could use the call out of this moment to actually create some systemic change. So could you tell us just briefly a little bit about what you call the call out from both of your perspectives?
Sure, I'll start. The call out essentially was an expression of frustration. So at the time, the Community Foundation was responding to the pandemic because at this point, George Floyd hadn't happened yet. We weren't aware of George Floyd. But the Community Foundation, in its response to COVID, had designated funding specifically for arts and culture organizations, which was really a commendable gesture for them to make. As you can imagine, everyone was rushing to basic needs. And a lot of us that are in the arts and culture community were concerned about our own livelihoods and how we would sustain through this pandemic, knowing that there was no clear end in sight. And so here, the Community Foundation made a very public announcement of $580,000 in funding to 11 arts organizations. And just as a person who has been a longtime advocate, creative in the Atlanta scene, I looked to the list to see who was awarded, and it was blaringly obvious to me that there weren't any Black organizations on the list, Black identifying, Black led. And at this point in the pandemic, we were abundantly clear that Black and Latinx communities were disproportionately being impacted by it because of the disparities, because of the inequities. And to me, it rang as just, another slant of the establishment in the face of a very critical moment that they couldn't even get that right. And so I took to Facebook, not with any intention of doing anything about it, but just to vent and to commiserate with other people that would share my same feelings.
And so Heather's post to Facebook, I'd like to say, was both a bane and a balm at the same time, if we're being honest, because what I woke up to on a Saturday were an abundance of emails from staff that says, "Hey, we're being called out for inequitable funding in the arts. How do we fix it?" Or rather, what tell us what we should do to fix it. And we had to have some really tough conversations about our initial approach to emergency response in a time of a pandemic that added barriers to entry instead of removing them. For our larger COVID response and recovery fund, which was a partnership between the Community Foundation and the United Way of Greater Atlanta, we removed a lot of barriers. With the Arts Fund, we did the opposite. We added a financial forecasting piece. We asked for additional financial information. We asked for organizations to make sure they filled out our common grant applications and organizational profile, which was a 14-page application process. And it was counter to what you do during an emergency. And so the bane part was, oh, now we have to figure this out. Now we really have to have these conversations that we were privileged enough to be able to avoid prior to COVID. As a funder, you walk into these spaces with this enormous amount of power because you have something that other people want. One of the things that some of my mentors in the funding space made very clear to me early on is to try to come from a place of humility when you walk into those spaces. And so that's what we did try to do, but we got it wrong, and and we had to figure out how to fix it in a time when we were going through some internal transitions, a lot of internal transitions, and everything had to happen in the public view, and that's why it became a bomb. Because when you don't have the privilege of cover to do your work behind the scenes, you don't have the luxury of cutting corners to make it easy for yourself. And so we had to go back to the drawing board. We had to say, hey, let's remove all these barriers that we put in place that are unnecessary. We had to start having conversations like, why do we have them there in the first place? Who do they benefit? We started to have conversations about, oh, let's look at our funding practices over the last 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. And then we had to have those very real conversations with people who we were in partnership with, who we had to say, we appreciate your partnership over the years, but what we need to do to move forward may not include you in the same way. And those are really hard conversations to have with people who we were in relationship with for a long time. And so, and if I'm talking too long, you let me know, but I had to spend a lot of time both arguing with myself around what my place was in this moment as a funder, as a Black woman, as a colleague of people both internally and externally, and how I was going to use this moment to move the work forward for community.
one of the little things about the call out that wasn't mentioned, that when we were planning, Heather mentioned that that you actually reached out to Katrina with your respect for her leadership in the community, and you let her know that it wasn't personal. This was actually a systemic call out. It wasn't a personal call out. And I thought the fact that you would both look at it in that way was fascinating. Do you have any thoughts, either of you, on that distinction between reaching kind of across the line to someone you respected and you held in high esteem, but you were really on both sides of an issue, and you let that be not personal and about structural change?
Well, at the time that I expressed my frustration, I knew Katrina was at the Community Foundation, but I didn't know her role and involvement with the Arts Fund. I didn't know anybody's involvement. Like I said, I was just venting, being completely, reactionary to something that I read and was missing for me. And it wasn't until the Community Foundation, shortly after making the post, that they weighed in. They didn't apologize, they didn't atone, they didn't address anything that I was saying. They instead had their marketing person say, hey, we open our grant making opportunities to everyone, and we welcome any sort of feedback or communication you want to give to us, when we come back from Memorial Day weekend, because this was the Friday before Memorial Day weekend. And I think that is, part of why this call out became a whole 3-month advocacy push, because it was this lack of accountability around something that was so blatantly obvious. And I didn't know the extent of this in the moment, but I was starting to feel this, right? Because again, we are like if y'all can recall, back in May, we're well into this pandemic. We don't know what the future looks like. We thought the summer we were all going to reopen our venues, and it was looking that wasn't the case, and Trump was doing what he was doing, and we were losing people that we love. And it was surfacing all of the inequity and disparity that we'd all been talking about, that people said wasn't true, that we're being too sensitive, and here it was across the globe, shutting down every community. And then a week later, we would see that video of George Floyd, and it would surface for us the most visceral of feelings and anger and rage. And on top of this, we can't even get money from our community foundation to support art. Like, are you kidding me? Like, hold on, this is Atlanta. If we can't get this right in Atlanta, the Black Mecca, then there is no chance that we're gonna get it right anywhere else. And it's that sort of like attitude and feeling. I mean, it was incredibly emotional. And all of the colleagues of mine in the arts and culture community who rang my phone, who texted me, who left messages saying, yeah, this has been my experience. This has been my challenge, trying to deal with the Community Foundation and being dismissed or invisible. And then it was the data that I would later see that showed the 27-year history of the fund, that we weren't just in a moment of inequity. We are talking about a legacy since the inception of the fund, where Black organizations in this very Black city, this city that is dominating, right, how we understand culture, this is the cultural pulse, had been ignored and dismissed and marginalized in all the ways that you can expect. And so, there was nothing for me to do but to champion this, because I'm not affiliated with an organization. I don't have fear of backlash. Maybe I should, but I didn't at that point. I think I was so, I was so overwhelmed by just the moment and the protests that were happening, and our mayor admonishing the Black community for standing up for themselves, and our old civil rights leaders calling us thugs for being in the streets, like just all of that, like the convergence of all of that, just creating this very hot, tense moment of agitation and feeling like, you can't deny me. I'm tired of hoping. I'm tired of being optimistic. Like, you will listen, you will invest. And if you don't, then there will be repercussions. And it was in that moment for me really important to change the narrative and to put the Black arts community in the driving seat where we were dictating what was going to happen.
Well, thank you, for sharing that, all of that passion behind it. I thought this would be a good segue to this next pillar, which to give Katrina a chance to respond. The call out happens. You mentioned that there was some internal work that the foundation started to do to address this very legitimate concern. But you also mentioned that there was some behind the scenes work maybe happening in terms of, Heather, you and Katrina having a relationship prior to all this happening. But you being a representative of the structure, I guess, Katrina, which you had mentioned, tell us a little bit about what happened at that point. Once this call out happens, some of the internal work happens, what was the response? And what was it like to be, kind of on that side of it as someone who represents the structure? And what is the structure?
Well, I'm going to go back a little bit and say that, prior to all of this, in 2018, the Community Foundation updated its strategic plan. And as a part of that strategic plan, a major part of that strategic plan update, the foundation said that we were going to prioritize equity into our programming and creating access to opportunity for all of Atlanta residents. And the internal work was happening very slowly at the foundation, trying to figure out what does that mean for our work, and what can our donors and our board and all of the stakeholders that are connected to the foundation, what do they have the appetite for with regards to equity? And I say that because prior to COVID, it seemed that our appetite for having equity conversations were pretty surface level. And staff will be pushing to do more with these equity conversations, but I go back to that definition of a community foundation and the balance between managing donors' expectations with the real work that's happening in communities and the work that needs to be done. So yeah, we were doing surface level conversations around equity. We were gonna have some facilitated meetings with community and figure out how to incorporate this into our programming. And then the world shut down, and we were hit in the face with the disproportionate level that Black and Brown people were being impacted with just a global health pandemic. And we said, oh, we really need to step up our equity game a little bit more. And then George Floyd came, and then we're like, oh, should we start having these racial? Should we call out race? Which sounds crazy, right? But I can say that when you are a foundation, you have to decide if you can do that or whether you can do that. If you are a person whose moral compass is connected to what they do, and Heart for Community is also connected, then there's no other choice than to address equity issues from a standpoint of race first. And the call out forced us to have to do that. And it continues to force us to move in that direction. So as a employee of the structure, I feel like it's my job to continue to advocate for those really strong conversations. And I also have to have the patience to continue to have those conversations, even when they fall on deaf ears sometimes, even when my wanting to move forward quickly pulls us back. And that's where the two-sided coin comes into play. Because without the push from the outside, without the voice of community saying, hey, Community Foundation, you said you were going to do this. You said you were prioritizing this. We don't see it. Then we don't have to do it as quickly. We can take our time. We can say we're weighing our options. But when we have to contend with the community, then yeah, we have to push. And so with that outside push, I feel it's my job and my role and the role of my peers within the organization to continue to make sure things move forward.
Thank you so much for sharing what that internal process is like. It's really rare to hear what really can happen internally with the community foundation, like where you are at, to talk about the internal process and to really be accountable to the community and the people you serve. So just to kind of close this topic off, I wanted to get back to Heather. So once there was some reciprocal acknowledgement to the call out, and as I think what we call here coming to the two sides of the coin, which you have the grant maker and the grantee, and that relationship, and I've seen it here in Los Angeles, can be quite complicated. But how did it work once the two of you, I guess not just the two of you, but the foundation and the organizations you're representing came to some sort of a middle ground? What was the outcome from there in terms of funding, and what was the change in the foundation's direction? Maybe Heather, you could talk about that.
Yeah, well, and I'll also preface is that I don't think I addressed this in my last remarks with regards to my relationship to Katrina and having an offline conversation. Like, that was in complete deference to her as a Black woman inside that institution. I think if Katrina had been a white woman, I don't think I would have made the same gesture, because as we were learning about George Floyd and Aubrey and others and Breonna Taylor, it was just not a moment I felt to be trying to make peace with white folks and institutions. I really felt that this was the moment where the reach out needed to be in our direction. And so it was only in deference to Katrina and knowing what it is like to be, one of a few within a predominantly white institution, trying to champion things like that and wanting to be a source of support, and to make it clear, as Amy mentioned, that this is not an attack on you or how you're doing your work. Like, I know what that's like. In terms of working with the Community Foundation through this process, I would say that, to this date, there has not been any sort of atonement or acknowledgement of the exclusion of Black arts organizations in this round and historically. And I think that is necessary and needed, and it can't come from Katrina. It's got to come from the top. And even in the Community Foundation's solidarity statement in response to George Floyd, like all the other solidarity statements, it's still this sort of detached, what white people need to do, what institution needs to do, without ever turning the mirror on themselves and acknowledging what we've done, the harm we've created, that we apologize for it, and this is the new way we want to chart forward. I have yet to see that in the Community Foundation and really in leadership period across our region. And I think that's necessary. I think the acknowledgement is necessary. I think it is especially necessary because they're not willing to do it. So that is still a gripe that I have. In terms of going through this process of advocacy, I mean, it was an all-out push. It was everything from galvanizing the Black arts community, specifically around this topic, hearing and understanding about their experiences, how they're funding themselves, how they are faring through this pandemic, how they were faring before the pandemic, really, for me personally, getting to understand the scale and scope of the community. And then having a public audience with the Community Foundation leadership to understand what happened. Where were the gaps? Where were the blind spots? And discovering that, as you can imagine, right? They didn't have a very, they didn't have a multiracial table to begin with. They said that they had a multiracial review committee, and we discovered that they didn't, right? They didn't have one Black person in their peer review process. And so we made recommendations about what needed to happen, everything from streamlining their application process to removing barriers that we discovered were, automatically disqualifying Black arts organizations from even being eligible, and demanding that in their last and final round of funding that they give, at minimum what they had already doled out to white organizations, but really encouraging them to spend the remaining 1.1 million that they had to deploy to all Black arts organizations. And so they made those changes to their application process. And we had 28 Black arts organizations apply. Of the nearly 100 that I identified over my research, many organizations I had never even known about, organizations that had been around 20 plus years. And I've been in Atlanta for 25, which was a delight to discover and learn about those groups. But 28 groups applied, 23 in total were awarded. 87% of the money that they doled out went to Black arts organizations, totaling $1,082,392. Unprecedented, like never before has that been done. And I should also note that in that application process, they also said that they were prioritizing Black founded, Black led, which was great. But it also gets to another issue that we have to contend with in the future when we are identifying racialized arts organizations, right? Because it's not so much that they're founded by Black people or that they are led by Black people as much as it is, these are organizations by virtue of the world that we live in, have to name themselves as such, have to be very articulate in their mission to say this is what they do, so that folks can be put on notice that this isn't a white experience, right? This isn't a white-centered experience. The National Black Arts Festival has to be called the National Black Arts Festival so that you know it's not the Arts Festival, which is by default a white institution. It has to explain to folks that it is here specifically for you. To be a Black organization, as I try to tell everyone, is a very political thing, whether you want it to be or not. It's political because you have to name yourselves in a way that your counterparts don't have to. And so this has been sort of a historic first step, and we hope that we can continue to nurture and foster the Community Foundation to move in this direction and to figure out how they can sort of pay the debt that is owed to the Black arts community through some sort of philanthropic reparations. And that if racial equity is in fact the center of their work going forward, that they are diligent and focused on lifting up Black voices, because that is the marginalized community of Atlanta. When you're talking about race, you're talking about Black folks, regardless of how many other terms you want to use, disenfranchised, marginalized, POC, BIPOC, we're talking about Black people. And so getting comfortable, getting them to get comfortable with saying Black is really important.
Thank you. In the interest of time, Amy, should we maybe shift to our final pillar here?
I think what we actually have to do is kind of wrap up and turn into questions. So I'd like everyone who's listening to think for a moment, and if you have thoughts and comments and insights or questions, to start thinking about those and start putting them into the chat. And we actually have the approval of Ms. Infantry and Ms. Zaberi to go over 10 minutes if we need to. But what I'd like to do as you're gathering your questions to give Ms. Zaberi a moment to talk about thriving communities and how you have said that the arts can be the voice and driver of change. And in this case, I think we're looking at not about Black arts or arts that have been happening that haven't been properly, and well, in this case, we're really looking at Black arts as a driver and voice of change for thriving communities. And I wondered if you, Ms. Zaberi, or Ms. Infantry had any other thoughts to say about that, in a way we can interpret that in our own way, because sometimes we think of what is the role of the arts in the thriving community? And I'm assuming that the foundation had to shift its focus a little bit to say, if we don't, essential, that first response includes the arts, because it has to, and it has to include Black arts.
A little background prior to my role at the foundation for the Atlanta Regional Commission, which is a regional planning agency, and I worked on a program which was an Arts Leaders in Metro Atlanta. That it was a leadership development program for people who worked in and for the community. What I learned there was that traditionally we see arts as like this extra thing that makes us happy in community. But the reality is arts and culture in any community is an economic driver for that community. It is both the voice and this through line of how you can tell if a community is actually thriving, right? And so it's not this added thing that you can take out of your budget when things get tight. It's really something that communities in totality need to continue to prioritize and focus on. And by amplifying Black arts and culture voices, what you do, like Heather mentioned earlier with Outcast, is you get to see early what's coming down the pike. You get to see you get to see what's coming, because the voice of artists and culture entrepreneurs really tells you where we're going as a society. And so when you think about a thriving community and why you should prioritize it, it's specifically because that's how you know if you're actually doing okay or if you're not. And it's, you find the most creative and innovative ways to challenge traditional structures and systems, to look at new ways of approaching things, and to find new partners with which to make change in your community. And so I'm hoping I answered your question, but
You did beautifully. Thank you so much. I think that's really significant, and it's inspiring for all of us to hear. I'd like to ask everyone, if you wouldn't mind, I know some people really only had a very strict 1 hour and they're going to have to leave because they only had the lunch. And I wondered if everyone could just turn on their their camera for a moment and I'd like to unmute you. And I just like to applaud our guest speakers, because they really are an example of how to use the passion and the intellect and the structure and the creativity to create the kind of change we're looking for. So I would just like to hear from everybody. I don't know if Evita is still here to unmute them, but I'd like to give them an applause, and I'd like to take a photograph for a memory, if that's okay. Because this takes a lot of, as my mother would say, chutzpah.
You know, on that note, I wanted to say, you know, it takes a lot of courage, honestly, to have this kind of conversation out in the open. The call out, it can be intense and in any context, but the way that you, Katrina, and the foundation have chosen to engage in that dialogue, and yes, as Heather mentioned, this is just the beginning. There's tremendous work to be done, and you know, the foundation with all of its resources has to do more. But at the same time, the fact that you're willing to be here today to talk and be open about that process, I think it indicates to me that the kind of courage both of you have. And I hope here in Los Angeles, we can take this as an example for our own funding institutions who have amassed great resources, and they too need to be held to account. And they're doing great work, but more needs to be done. And when the community does speak up, they need to respond. So, you know, thank you so much for sharing your insights today.
Yeah, and thank you for
thank
everyone
you so much for
come as
having
well
us.
too. Because, you know, this is the kind of education we want and the kind of professional growth and development we want to really stay at the forefront of creative work. So now it's time to post your questions or thoughts or insights in the chat. And we have 5 or 10 minutes to engage with our speakers. And thank you, everybody, so much.
Hi. So my question is that as future and current arts leaders, what do you guys who are working, you guys are working in the space of fundraising in some capacity. And so I wanted to know what you guys want to expect from the next generation of leaders, kind of a call to action of sorts.
Wow.
I think so one of the things that was told to me when I first entered into the foundation space is that from an older you know, philanthropist, was that you guys get to say and do things that we couldn't years ago, right? So, you know, the thing that I would expect or that I would ask is that you continue to to push just a little bit more in these spaces where there's this propensity to kind of go back to normal, to when things die down, then we can just ease back into comfortable. And it's really our role to continue to agitate in the different ways that we are in.
Yeah, I think that's yeah, keep, you know, pushing the conversation forward. I think you'll get into organizations and they'll seem good on the surface, and then you'll get into it and things will be terribly wrong. And the instinct might be to just go along, and I would encourage you not to. Call it out. I don't mean that you have to disrupt and agitate, but you know, I think lifting up where things can be better and should be better, and taking copious notes, documenting everything, I think is really important. And then I think the other piece of that is as you are building your career and establishing yourself, like being very intentional about the affinity space that you create. You know, if it's fundraising that you're going into, like have a collaborative table of fundraisers that you commiserate with all the time. It helps to remind you that you're not alone, because a lot of these institutions are really small and you're shouldering a whole lot of things that in a larger corporation is, you know, 100-person department. And so having that support system, I think, is really critical and important.
Thank you both so much.
I had a question, one for Heather and one for Katrina. First of all, what the work you guys have done is an excellent model for, so I wish I could take it to my job, because it just shows how the work can be done well and done together. And so I just wondered for Katrina, how many other organizations have you know, opened themselves up to this new way of being, to really look at themselves? Are you working with more, you know, other organizations? And for Heather, I wonder the percentage of African Americans working at your funding organization, and was that difficult? Did you feel like you were carrying the burden by yourself? I just wondered what the percentage of us where you work.
So with regards to other foundations, other philanthropic organizations, I think we're all contending with we're grappling with the same issues, and we're all looking to do it better. Some are further along than others. For us as a community foundation in Atlanta, I think that we still have a lot of work to do. But I'm encouraged by the conversations that philanthropic organizations are having around being more explicit around equity, about pushing the dynamics of power in a direction that places community more central to the decision making. And you know, it doesn't just start with us. There are a lot of organizations that have been having these conversations for quite a while. I think we can no longer just stay with business as usual. And so I'm hopefully optimistic about the direction that philanthropy is going.
Mm-hmm.
And to answer your question, Yvonne, I'm not part of an organization. Prior to this call out, I was working with a startup that was pretty much paused because of COVID. So I had a lot of time on my hands at the time that I was doing this advocacy. And just in terms of just percentage of African American identifying fundraisers, we have an association that's national based here called the African American Development Officers Network. And I know that they were formed and created in response to sort of like the void of leadership in the Association for Fundraising Professionals, particularly the Atlanta chapter. And so I think you could look to those resources to see what those numbers are. But, you know, we definitely are a small, you know, we represent a small number of the sector overall.
Well, small and mighty. I want to make sure to give any last participants a chance to call out an issue.
I see,
Danielle Hill, will you like to share your comment publicly?
Yeah, I was really inspired by the piece of like checking in with each other, despite you know, calling out like practices, because it's so important that we stick together in this endeavor and we do it together, like Yvonne said.
Beautiful. Well, I know everyone is busy with school and with work, and I just want to together thank our guest speakers and to let you know that we really heard you and we are inspired by you. And as you can all see, there's this wonderful creative tension between agitation and structural change and collaboration and calling out. And when done right, we do more than just frustrate ourselves. We actually move the dial. We make things better with community, and that is a great accomplishment. So thank you so much, Katrina DeBerry and Heather Infantry. We wish you all the best. Please count on us in your circle of support professionally. And thank you for making time in your busy lives for speaking with us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Katrina and Heather.